Now it's a pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Willeke Slingeland. Dr. Willeke Slingeland is the head of Section Research Group on Resilient Democracy. She has 30 years of experience in good governance and integrity research. She has worked with governments, the business sector, media, and civil society to promote integrity by means of collective action. Willeke has a particular interest in exploring the link between networks and corruption. She was the lead researcher of the 2012 NIS Netherlands project, which she carried out by order of Transparency International Netherlands. Willeke is passionate about providing professionals and students with a set of knowledge, skills, and competencies to strengthen their individual and collective integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, I request your attention for our keynote speaker, Dr. Willeke Slingeland, Lecturer Resilient Democracy at the Section Hogeschool. Please come forward.
Yeah, so good evening to all of you, to both excellencies, to all of you who came here for this important topic. Thank you, Armand Hessels, with the Stichting Deugdelijk Bestuur Aruba. It's been amazing how actively engaged you've been on this important topic. As the moderator already mentioned, I've been involved in good governance for quite some time, but I haven't seen that much passion about such a, tough topic. So I'm very pleased to discuss, the findings of the NIS report with all of you. And I'm very pleased to be here in real life together with my colleague, because we have been working on this NIS project for 2 years from, remote, long distance, and it hasn't been that much fun to actually do it only via desk research and interviews. So I'm very pleased. Today we've already met quite some stakeholders in place, and I look forward to all the meetings, formal meetings, informal meetings, to make sure that this important topic, this is the kickoff, that actually it's been heard and implemented in the coming years. So this is my first slide, and as you can see, you see a lot of change on the right-hand side, as a symbol of what a system should look like. You probably heard in the Netherlands we had a huge scandal, the child benefits scandal, in which many governmental organizations like ministries, tax authority, thought that child benefits receivers were fraudsters, and this leads to a huge, huge scandal. And the thing that really struck me is that actually, the Netherlands is considered to be a well-established democracy, that even a well-established democracy can never take democracy and good governance for granted. You should actually strive for good governance on a daily basis. And what is also a very important sign is to think of ourselves as individuals and as organizations as change in a bigger system. If we look at corruption only from a bribery perspective, so one abuses a power for the other and somebody gets something in return, this is a simple way of looking at corruption. What I'm trying to say, to visualize here, is that corruption is much more complex. Bad governance is much more complex. It's about informal circuits which can undermine checks and balances in any democracy. So we should never take that for granted, the well-respected democracy. And we are all part of actually promoting good governance and fighting corruption. So some of the background info. Some of the dates were already mentioned. We were asked to do this NIS research assessment quite some years ago. And of course, we were enthusiastic about it because we have been trained in using the methodology by the anti-corruption watchdog Transparency International. And maybe if you heard about it, you know that it's situated, its secretary in Berlin. And up till now, it has about 160 chapters around the world. And in 2012, we were also involved in the Netherlands NIS assessment, which was part of the pan-European research. And I'm particularly enthusiastic about this method because, like I mentioned, if you look at good governance, looking at small forms of corruption or very plain and classic forms of corruption, you miss the bigger picture of, well, how organizations work together and actually strive for good governance or poor governance. So the NIST methodology uses this systemic approach, and I think that's the way we should look at democracy, rule of law, and to good governance, because then you get a good picture of the outcome as a whole. And that's what we are interested in as citizens. How do we actually notice good governance or poor governance? So this methodology is a very valuable tool because it gives you a very clear idea of what patterns of influencing decision-making actually become visible in a specific country. This is a 2-year project. It was supposed to be a 1-year project, but already COVID was mentioned. So it took us a lot of extra time, I must say. We were hoping that we would finalize it in 1 year, and it took us 2 years. We were supposed to do around 24 interviews. That's actually what the method describes, 2 interviews per pillar. We talked to 70 persons. So thank you to all of you who actually also were open for an interview. I see some of you are here today. And that was very valuable set of data which we received. Well, today I'm here with Thomas Riemersma, but there are 4 other colleagues who were involved, and well, we had a great fun in doing so. Well, like I mentioned, it's the kickoff. So often such a report, everybody's enthusiastic and think, okay, we are all on the same page, let's do this. But then it becomes, well, stuck in one of your cupboards, and nobody actually feels responsible of bringing this bigger message out in the world. So I was very pleased with hearing about the strategic integrity agenda and the law proposals which already have been made. So we should actually accept this, adopt this as a kickoff. We are all ambassadors of this NIST report. So all of us should think about how can I get this bigger picture? How can I have the recommendations be implemented? And that's what we've done in other countries as well. So have specific organizations, sectors, target groups actually accepting these recommendations as ambassadors and bring success about. Should I pinpoint it here or? Okay. Yeah. So what is the NIST assessment? It was mentioned already quite some time. It thinks of integrity as a Greek metaphor temple. So if you see this image, you can see the foundations, the political, institutional, socio-political, and socio-economic foundations. Any democracy, no matter where, should have a solid foundation in which there is enough money, there's well-being, there are strong institutions, there's public trust, all very important aspects on which you can actually build institutions. So if the foundations are weak, like we've noticed in COVID times when, well, economic recession was about to take place, or when big scandals hit a country, corruption scandals, public trust goes down, the foundations immediately are influenced by that. So you can build whatever institutions, Bureau of Integrity, Ombudsman, but if the foundations are weak, they won't become strong pillars. So that's a very important systemic way of looking at integrity. If you look at the pillars, we see 13 different pillars. So every NIST should actually, is there maybe a glass of water? And you should stand here. So every pillar is composed of 1 or more organizations. So of course you have the judiciary. Thank you. De rechterlijke macht, you have the legislator, you have the ombudsman, you have political parties, all important institutions within a society, which all have a specific role to support integrity. So what we've done, we've looked at the foundations. We went to many books which have been written about Aruba, many publications, news articles. We spoke to, well, experts in the fields of these foundations. But of course, we went to go through each of these pillars. Each pillar should have its own independence in rules, should have its own resources, capacity. Is there enough money? Is there enough staff? Transparency rules. Do we actually disclose the way we make decisions or the way we do our permits? Oh yeah, thank you. So we've looked at all these institutions, we looked at the laws and we looked at the practice, because you can have many laws in place which promote integrity, but if the practice is poor, if they are not implemented, not respected, it's just paperwork. So that's actually in basic what we did. And on the right-hand side, you see a weak civil society actually making sure that all institutions fall down. It's like a domino effect. So either you have a strong or a weak foundations, and you have strong and weak institutions. And the whole idea about the system is that even if it's only one institution which is weak, as for example a public sector, all other institutions are deteriorating and they all collapse. And this is a democracy going down. This is a democracy not having rule of law in place. And why is it important? Well, good governance is the precondition of all other things. So if we talk about how we should organize a society, how do we actually make sure that benefits are shared? How do we make sure that we, know how to fight climate change? Good governance is always the precondition for all other complex causes which we as a society are, faced with. So that should never be second-order issue. No matter where, good governance is the legitimacy of, why we are the way we are. So here, the right-hand side, this is not what you would like to see. And actually, you could say that some of the Aruba-ness looks like this. So there are very weak institutions in Aruba which influence all others. And I will go into the details. The last thing I would like to say is that the bullet points up there are sustainable development, quality of life, and rule of law. So these are the outcomes, these are the main reasons why we should actually have a strong integrity system. Yeah, thank you. So, what are the distinctive features of the Aruba-ness assessment? Well, of course, we come across the fact that Aruba has a small island situation. So it's a very close community with a lot of people who know one another. Many people share combinations of roles and functions, which make it also a very important social capital. So one knows one another and everybody's actively involved. But all good things also have a disadvantage. And of course, knowing one another, being very close to one another, having the networks and acquaintances is also a risk of preferential treatment and what I would say network corruption. So the second bullet point, a lot of informal circuits could be found here in Aruba. And some of the things I will say today are not new to all of you. Many reports have been written about Aruba, and of course, also the reports by the Central Bank of Aruba about corruption. We are aware of the figures, we are aware of the size of corruption. But again, this is about trying to understand what the mechanisms are which make the system, relatively weak. So the informal circuits here are stronger than the formal structures. And the formal structures are the ones we have on paper. Those are the checks and balances. Those are about how the judiciary should be independent and how the legislator, the Staten, should actually be independent and be a controlling party. So if we agree and if we actually find that the informal circuits here are very, strong, this means that there is an informal circuit which is stronger than everything we do on paper, everything we try to do formally. And this is I would say a very weak spot in the Aruban national integrity system. One other aspect which won't be a surprise to you is the low trust. No matter who we spoke to, there's a low trust generally in governments, in institutions. And actually this is influencing the foundations on which every institution should fulfill its role. Can you ever be a controlling party, or can you ever be an independent ombudsman? Or can you be an electoral management body in charge of organizing the elections or in charge of overseeing the financial situation of political parties, if the low trust is there? So this is a reason on its own already to try to stimulate good governance, because if the trust is low, all things you can actually organize and build, they won't be a success. What also was new for us as a team is the culture of fear. And I think that's a very important thing to realize. If there's low trust, but there's also a general sense of, fear of reciprocal, that you actually do not dare to speak out within organizations, or you do not dare to talk about dilemmas, this won't bring society further. So we tried, of course, to have interviews, and in the first initial response was that people were afraid to talk about it. So that was already a sign that something in the foundational level is not correct at the moment. So we were pleased that at the end we were able to talk to a lot of interviews, but this is something which is very difficult to pinpoint what is the reason, but this is very important to try to analyze with one another. And the last bullet point, the decisive role played by political parties. If we look at the connections, there's family connections and there's connections among political parties, which are, the general denominator within these networks. And everything seems to be organized and decided by these networks and these political parties. So in a sense of individual roles of the pillars within the NIST, the independence is at risk because of these connections. I don't think this works, so maybe you will. So, on the 2nd of May, we will have a long debate, a discussion about all the details of the NIST. What I will now do is briefly mention the mechanisms which we came across. So, what we generally noticed that across many institutions, there is a lack of urgency, a lack of culture on reporting. So what you expect in a society, in a well-established democracy, is that each institution, is making sure that it's transparent about what they do, how they decide, so that the public, us, all of us citizens, can actually know how this institution decided the way it did. For example, the Staten, the highest body of a democracy, the parliament. You would expect all the parts of a decision-making process or of a legislation process to be out in the open on its website, and we didn't find it. We simply couldn't find it. So this is a very basic requirement by law, very basic criterion which we assessed, and actually this was lacking. And the Staten was not the only organization. If we looked at civil society organizations, businesses, annual reports, who are the board members, how a board member is selected, all this kind of information is not automatically to be found on the websites of these major institutions. So this is generally an observation. We should improve in Aruba the urgency, the responsibility in terms of being open about how decisions are made. Supervision is lacking. So in terms of internal checks and balances, do we have internal organizations within the different institutions which actually supervise the way decisions are made? This is generally lacking as well. So supervising in the way of audits, for example. And one thing, I must say, this might seem a bit harsh, but we concluded that there's no academic tradition. Of course, there's the University of Aruba, which does great, it fulfills great education and has a very interesting research program set up. But generally, if we were looking for academic journals in which Aruba as a society was described, or we searched for journals which were dealing with the political parties, what are the movements within political parties, there was little to no body of knowledge. And I think every well-established democracy, every proud democracy should actually make an urgency of researching its own. It cannot only be done by international researchers. So we were very pleased with the help of the students from the University of Aruba who did part of the research, part of the field work. And I guess this is the beginning of making integrity an important topic in a research agenda and making sure that Aruba ends up in the international journals, that actually it becomes a body of knowledge on which you can actually do evaluations. And I guess this is also very important as seeing the NIST as a kickoff. You could actually say, well, this is the baseline, and if we do more academic research, we can also go much deeper into individual institutions, write about it, and make sure that the academics know about Aruba. Well, lack of information. This was also generally on many, I mentioned the lack of transparency, but generally there's a lot of information missing on websites which are not up to date. And when we asked for specific informations, again, from, for example, the Staten, it simply was not to be found. So this is generally something which is considered to be a weakness. Yes, please. What I would like to see is that the younger generation, to which we also spoke, that they actually become proud of Aruba, and they are proud and they are happy to a certain sense, but actually that there are certain figures which become an exemplary figure of a superhero which is a part of the good governance. So that integrity, good governance is adopted by the younger generation, and that they feel that there is hope and that they can be part of this change. So we cannot continue with very harsh terms into saying Aruba is very corrupt. We should also say the things which are good, and I think we heard of many initiatives going on which are hopeful, but make sure that also the younger generation sees that actually it's cool to be acting with integrity, not to be part of the old-fashioned way of doing things. In terms of education, primary, but also high school and also the university, of course, that's the leadership and integrity, and that's, I think, at the university a good start. But it's very important to start also a movement from, bottom up, to make children aware of their moral vocabulary, that they have a critical attitude, that they demand democracy. And this is, of course, the most important thing in talking about a systems change, that children feel that they can express and that they can demand and that they can actually show that they are accountable, that they take responsibility. So all the things we do today and all things that the government will be doing in terms of laws and making sure that we are complying with all the international standards, this is a good thing, but the movement from bottom up, that there's a new generation having this moral vocabulary, is a very important thing. And this is needed, especially with all the other new challenges which the younger generation is confronted with. For example, the digital transformation we are all as a society are seeing, so that children also know what is fake news, what is real, so the information that they can distinguish the right from the wrong. And that's also related to the other bullet point, the indifference towards corruption. I think that we should make sure that, of course, the harsh things, harsh messages are also being said, but there's also a time that we should bring hope and that we should actually say, but things can change. If you remember my first slide, looking at how a system, you can be the wheel actually going into the right direction. And if many wheels are all turning into the right direction, a system can change over time. Legal transplant, another thing which we came across. Of course, with the historical background, there are some of the laws or institutions which are derived from the Dutch model. And I think it's very important that Aruba is very critical towards what things do you adopt or do you take over from, European perspective? And when do you actually say, no, this won't work in our society because we have a different society. And I had a great discussion already with the Prime Minister recently. For example, looking about the family connections and ties. Is it possible to make a rule in which you say, and actually it has been done, who can you appoint as a family member in your own situation as a minister? It's not up to us in this research to say this is actually what the rules should be like, but actually make sure that you have a discussion which is actually taking into account the typical situation here, and that is that there are very important family connections. But it should be open, it should be transparent, and it should be part of the public debates. And laws can change, public norms can change, and I think it's very important that this legal transplant is, I should say, not an automatic response. So do not take over all other international standards. Make sure that you as a society agree upon this one. Techno-optimism. In all the countries I've visited as a good governance researcher, I also see that if there's low trust in each other, low trust in governments, we hope that technology takes over. And I think there was also a little bit of mentioning e-government maids. And of course, technology can do great things. We can have, a way of the judiciary, which can actually randomly select cases So there won't be any preferential treatment in a way a judge takes over a verdict. We see e-procurement, so making sure that procurement is done automatically and software actually decides what the procurement should look like. But I'm also afraid, because I've seen it in many countries, that technology is the solution where trust fails. So even if there are good ideas about how to implement new technological solutions here in Aruba, make sure that there's a paragraph, a concrete plan on how should you actually invest also in the moral deliberation. The human being, the critical thinking cannot left alone. So every technical solution should actually also mean an investment in critical thinking by those who are involved. Otherwise, you will have a child benefit scandal as we had in the Netherlands, in which we trust the artificial intelligence, and after all, we all think, how could it happen that we, all these bright minds, actually did not see the outcomes of this technology? So, going back to the integrity in education, I would say invest in the basic aspects of integrity in education, and end with a specific link to integrity and the technology. Yes, please. Already mentioned a few times, there's no grand model, quick fix to strengthen the NIS. We concluded that it's a weakness, and I'm hopeful that things can change, but there's no one thing which we can do that actually makes this NIS very strong tomorrow. So it should be baby steps. It should be baby steps which will influence public trust, which influence accountability, which takes back ownership of individual institutions. And I guess the one thing which I would really would like to welcome is have this public debate about the networks, about the family ties, about the party affiliation. When do we think this is acceptable, and when is it completely an informal circuit undermining all things which we have organized on paper? And this is up to, the Aruban society. And I guess there are many platforms like the University of Aruba, which could actually be a good place to have such discussions. The Stichting Deugdelijk Bestuur Aruba is here by order of the Stichting. We did this research, but generally speaking, civil society is also a weak pillar. Many topics which are related to good governance, but there's only a few who are actually actively engaged. And this is the only thing which you can do. It should be from the bottom up. It cannot be done top down. So all of us should actually be engaged in no matter what, but think about how can you be engaged in striving for good governance, whether it's writing or whether it's having discussions, because integrity can never be done on your own. It's not that you can actually look into the mirror and say, am I acting with integrity? Because every individual person thinks of him or herself as acting with integrity. I've never met somebody who said, I'm not acting with integrity. So this requires practicing, and this is something we can only do by actually talking to one another and making sure that we practice how to make integrity alive and not to make it, a general value which we all agree upon, but nobody knows how to actually put this into practice. So what do we mean by it in this situation? And what values are at stake? And what is my role in this? And this is something you can do. You can be a pioneer, you can be an ambassador of this way of thinking. And of course, corruption itself, there have been attempts made, but too often still we all consider us to be, corruption is a victimless crime, so nobody's actually a victim. So I would definitely call out and say, make sure that you show what actually this is, the damage of corruption is. So whether it's poor education, whether it's poor healthcare or bad infrastructure, make sure that you actually see what has been done by this corrupt money, that we are all victims of it, and democracy as a concept is victim of this. Very important, especially also to the Prime Minister and the Minister here. The automatic appointing of ministerial posts, very important to stop that, to make sure that everybody is actually being appointed on the merites, on what have you achieved, and not any other, for any other reason. And parliaments. Again, I mentioned the Staten before. I still hope we get to meet some of the Staten MPs. But this is actually one of the weakest pillars which we saw in the NIS Aruba. So the Staat and the Parlement. I mentioned that there's no transparency about the legislation process, but also there is no accountability. It was difficult for us to get to speak to them. And I guess this is the highest body, the elective, this is where our, persons should be, and they should actually be open and being, showing what democracy is like. This is the highest body. All children know if we vote, this is where our sovereignty goes to. These are the people who actually act and behave and think in a general interest. So that's the biggest challenge, and I would like to see, if we look at 5 years from now, I hope that big steps have been made towards this pillar. Because I think in the NIS, if this body, this institution is weak, like I mentioned, it will have a domino effect on all other institutions. So this is the one institution which should lead by example, for sure. So control government. That's basically it. It's not rocket science. The last bullet point here, again, it's about transparency, but we also noticed that there is little of archiving. So it's not only the day-to-day information of legislation process, decision-making process, which we could not find, but also the older pieces of documentation which were not to be found. And that makes it impossible for media to be a watchdog. It makes it impossible for the future ombudsman to be a watchdog. It makes it impossible for us as citizens to be a watchdog. We need watchdogs. Democracy as a concept can only work if we have watchdogs in place. And this might hurt now and then, but we all gain from it because it makes us all critical thinkers and makes sure that we, again, have to realize, do we do the things we do on the right way? Ombudsman, I mentioned, of course, there are plans actually to appoint an ombudsman, but I would not dare to be an ombudsman in Aruba, I must say. In this situation, to be a High Council of State, to actually scrutinize public decision-making in terms of behoorlijkheid, even the rechtmatigheid is already an issue. So this is a big challenge. I know that there are many, very established individuals who would like to be appointed or would like to apply for such position, but you need to be very brave in order to stand out from the crowds in a system where you have to criticize the ones you love, the ones you are close to. So this is something also for, I guess, the period, the next 2 years. How does the government actually make sure that the electoral management body, the National Ombudsman, these High Council of States, which can be great watchdogs, that those qualified individuals within your society actually dare to apply, but also make sure that they have backing, that they are independent and they do not lose their reputation because they are performing as a watchdog. Of course, the Public Prosecution Office, this is also, I guess, plain language, should be legally separated from the Ministry of Justice and Social Affairs. So these, you could say, are quick fixes. This is something which you could organize in, not so much time. Ombudsman already mentioned, also the position of the Electoral Council, especially because there will be new responsibilities in terms of controlling and supervising the financial situation of political parties. Those kind of transparency and supervising this is a very challenging job. And the 4 last bullet points: abolish the permissive practice. So individual decisions on permits. These are very plain, everybody is aware of it. We heard it nearly in all interviews, but it's still standing practice. And this is also, laaghangend fruit. This is something which we can decide today to stop with this informal decision-making and favorable treatment. The University of Aruba, the research agenda, I've seen bits and pieces of it, but I hope we can talk about that also the 2nd of May. I know there are many, many good ideas about leadership and SDGs and many combinations, and I think that's very important to make sure that integrity actually is mainstreamed, actually is made operational in terms of other major topics. But of course, this is also getting this message across. I mentioned already the academic research. Make sure that the wider audience, also outside Aruba, is aware of the research which is done here and that we can actually do some comparative research. Yes, please. So I'm about to finalize my conclusions. Embrace internal criticism. This is the most challenging thing, and this is something we also in the Netherlands suffer from. As a general, we as individual human beings, we have difficulty in accepting some form of criticism because we feel that we are offended. We like to also defend ourselves. But this is something which we can train, how to be critical in a constructive way, but also to see some criticism as a way, an opportunity to think over, to reconsider the way you do the things you do. And this is culture-wide. This is in all institutions, in all departments with institutions. So this is low-level challenging the internal watchdogs. And if you are practicing that enough, hopefully it's not needed to have whistleblowers in place. But of course, there should be very strong protection for whistleblowers, those who dare at the end to speak out if internally nothing is done with the concerns. Intermediate persons, we came across many positions, you could say, as an intermediary between ministers and all kind of tussenpersonen. And of course, there's little to no transparency. And this is also something which is part of the informal circuit, which is a very, undermining the integrity system of Aruba. And the last bullet point I already mentioned, technology, make sure that the techno-optimism is not dominant on it. So make sure that you invest in the ethical part as well. Yes, please. Yeah. So that was a very short wrap-up. 2 years of research with a solid methodology having to be summarized in only 30 minutes. I hope you have noticed some of the features of the Aruban system. Generally speaking, I'm still hopeful, although my message might sound critical, because I know systems can change. I've seen systems change. But of course, we should all be part of the change. So please be this ambassador in whatever capacity you are here today. So thank you very much for your attention.